Today, we're going to talk about a well-known urban legend in Korea, the story of a woman with a red hairpin. Many taxi drivers have reportedly seen her, and most of them faced terrible misfortune afterward. Today, I'll tell you one of these stories. There was a taxi driver named Park Sang-hyuk in Seoul, Korea. He was in his 50s and had been driving taxis for over 30 years. Park liked working the night shift because there were fewer cars on the road and the work was easier. But like any big city, Seoul's night wasn't always calm and peaceful. Park often encountered drunks, gangsters, petty criminals, and women of the night. Fortunately, other than the drunks, most people rarely caused him trouble. Park often shared his stories with the younger drivers at his company, and there was one night he said he would never forget. It was a late autumn night, around 3 a.m., and he was driving in Gangnam district. The air was chilly, and the streets were quiet. Neon lights flickered, casting faint glows on the empty corners. Park had been driving since 7 p.m. and was thinking about calling it a night and heading home. He figured he might be able to take just one more passenger and add a bit more to his day's earnings. Suddenly, the ride-hailing app on his phone made a sound, indicating a new request. Park glanced at the screen. The pickup location was at the edge of Gangnam in an old residential area, and the destination was Gwangju in Gyeonggi Province. Gwangju in Gyeonggi Province? Park muttered to himself. He hesitated. It was quite far to drive at this hour. However, the fare was high. It was a long-distance ride, and for a taxi driver, that was hard to resist. After some consideration, Park decided to accept the request. The app showed that the passenger was a woman, last name Kim, and the pickup time was 3:30 a.m. Park wondered what kind of person needed a ride at this hour. He drove to the pickup location following the navigation. It was a dark and empty alley, and there were barely any streetlights. Most of the buildings were dark, with only a few windows showing faint light. Occasionally, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind could be heard. Maybe she's a drunk girl with an emergency, Park thought as he parked the car. When he arrived, he followed the protocol and called the passenger's number from the app. The phone rang a few times before a soft voice answered. It was gentle, but there was something eerie about it. "Hello, is this my ride? I'm behind you." Park was startled and instinctively looked through the rearview mirror. Sure enough, there was a figure standing behind his car. It was a woman in a light-colored coat, her hair loose. The most noticeable thing about her was the bright red hairpin, which stood out sharply in the dim night. "She was behind me all along." Park felt a chill run down his spine, but he brushed it off and unlocked the back door for her. The woman walked slowly toward the car. Her steps were heavy, as if every step took a great deal of effort. She opened the door quietly, keeping her head down, and got in. Her coat collar was pulled high, almost covering her face completely. "Miss, please, fasten your seatbelt," Park said. The woman responded softly, "Okay." Park nodded and focused on driving. He left the city and headed toward the highway. The atmosphere in the car grew heavier. The woman didn't use her phone, didn't look outside, and didn't speak. She just kept her head down, sitting there silently. Park felt an unusual tension in the air, as if something was pressing down on him. He tried to get a better look at her through the rearview mirror, but her face was hidden in the shadows. He couldn't make out her expression. He cleared his throat, trying to break the uneasy silence. "Miss, why are you going to Gwangju at this hour? Is there some emergency?" The woman in the back seat didn't respond. She didn't even lift her head. She clutched her coat tightly, as if trying to suppress something. Park's unease grew stronger, and he started feeling that this ride wasn't quite right. The car sped down the highway, the darkness outside stretching endlessly. Occasionally, the distant taillights of trucks flickered in the night. As they drove on, Park noticed that the temperature in the car seemed to be dropping. He adjusted the heater, but the cold still seemed to seep in from all directions, chilling him to the bone. Suddenly, Park noticed through the rearview mirror that the woman had lifted her head and was staring straight ahead. Her face was blurry in the dim light, but he could barely see her lips moving as if she was murmuring something. The sound was so faint that he couldn't make out the words, but it made his skin crawl. Sweat began to form in Park's palms. He instinctively wanted to turn around to check on her, but the memory of what he had just seen made him hesitate. He was afraid of what he might see. The car eventually left the highway and entered a remote country road. The navigation showed that they were nearing the destination. The surroundings grew darker, with fields and scattered trees on both sides of the road. Occasionally, they passed a few abandoned houses, their windows swallowed by the night. Suddenly, the woman spoke, her voice as faint as a breeze. "Driver, please stop at the empty lot up ahead." Park's heart tightened, but he didn't dare refuse. After all, it was reasonable for a passenger to request a stop. He slowly pulled over to an empty lot, turned off the engine, and turned around. "Miss, we're here. Do you need any help?" The back seat was empty. A wave of fear surged from his feet to his head, and cold sweat rolled down Park's forehead. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had heard her voice, had seen her get in, but now she was nowhere to be found. The air inside the car turned freezing cold. Park's eyes caught something on the backseat floor, a red hairpin lying there quietly. Its red color seemed to glow like blood in the darkness. Park couldn't take it anymore. He threw open the car door and stumbled out, gulping in the cold night air. He tossed the red hairpin away, got back into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as he could. After returning to Seoul, Park began feeling increasingly unwell. He suffered from frequent headaches and insomnia. He hadn't driven the night shift for days, trying to rest, but every night, he had the same nightmare. He dreamt of the woman with the red hairpin standing by his car, reaching out to open the door. Her face was still a blur, but that red hairpin was always so vivid. A few days later, Park mustered the courage to tell a few close friends about what had happened that night. Most of them didn't believe him, thinking it was just a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But Park knew in his heart that it had all truly happened. Eventually, needing to make a living, Park went back to work. One late night, he received another ride request. The pickup location was once again that same alley in Gangnam. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly canceled the ride, deciding he wasn't going to take any chances. But just minutes after he canceled, he suddenly felt a chill down his back. Instinctively, he looked into the rearview mirror, and there she was again, the woman with the red hairpin, sitting in the back seat, her head down, motionless. Park screamed and yanked the steering wheel, causing the car to swerve off the road and crash into the guardrail. He was rushed to the hospital and fortunately survived, but his mental state was never the same. Park quit his job as a taxi driver and never worked in anything related to driving again. His story eventually spread among the taxi drivers in Seoul, becoming an urban legend. Many drivers began avoiding late-night pickups from dark alleys, especially those involving female passengers with red hairpins. Some people thought it was all exaggerated, just another ghost story. But more and more drivers claimed they too had seen a flash of red in their rearview mirrors late at night, a familiar red hairpin glowing faintly before vanishing.